real pleasure to be coming to you today on this topic of estimating the size of illicit financial flows, which happens to be part of the 2030 Agenda Global Monitoring Framework. And we're bringing to you today a project that is about to start here in Asia Pacific around strengthening the capacity at the national level, so strengthening your capacity to monitor SDG target 16.4. Now, we have with us today a really great team to bring to you information about this project. We have with us Enrico Bisogno from the UN Head of the Data and Development Dissemination Section at UN Office of Drugs and Crime. And UNODC is the lead specialised agency for drugs and crime. And in particular, the UNODC Statistics Division is leading work on all areas of measuring crime, criminal justice, also doing a lot of work on governance statistics. So I'll hand over to Enrico in a minute to step you through this project. But we also have with us today Steve McFeely, the Chief Statistician of UNCTAD, which is the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Now, UNCTAD have a particularly strong role in this area of financial flows, trade, a whole range of other things, and they're partnering with UNODC in this area of measuring illicit financial flows. And as you'll hear through the presentation, this is not an easy area of statistics to measure, and we've got to put in place a robust measurement framework that's also quite practical. And I think between UNODC and UNCTAD, we have some real leadership to be able to do that. We have also with us today, and it's a real pleasure to introduce you to Ms. Salome. Salome, I won't introduce your surname, you can introduce Flores. Salome is the lead of a Centre of Excellence, the UNODC INEGI Centre of Excellence for Statistical Information on Government, Crime, Victimization and Justice Statistics. Now, INEGI is the Mexican National Statistics Office, and many years ago, the Centre of Excellence was established under Salome's leadership to really put focus in the Latin America and Caribbean region on this really important area. So we're going to hear from Salome on how well this measurement framework and the testing of it's gone in Latin America and the Caribbean. So you can hear from another region just how practical and how doable this area of illicit financial flows measurement is. I will then also share with you some practical steps to do with this project, and essentially where today's cafe is inviting you to get involved. So we're kickstarting today's launching of a project is to encourage you to put forward an expression of interest to be part of this project that will take place over the next two and a half years. And we're bringing you this information from UNODC, UNCTAD and the UNODC INEGI Centre of Excellence to encourage you to think about whether this topic is relevant to you and whether the next couple of years is really good timing for you to get involved in measuring, not only measuring at your country level, but also contributing to the development of standards, measurement standards in this space. Just some basic housekeeping. So we're on MS Teams. If you haven't used this before, there's a functionality bar that's now at the top of the screen that lets you raise your hand for questions, put questions in the chat box. We've allowed it 30 minutes for questions for this session. So we're really very keen to answer any questions you have. But I think what we'll do is we'll run through the three presentations and then allow for questions before wrapping up. So please either raise your hand or put a question in the chat box and we'll come to you. We'll also, if you do accidentally put yourself on speaker, we'll probably turn you back off to mute and just to help with the sound quality. And if at any time you have connection problems, we suggest you turn your video off because that can actually help with broadband connectivity. And finally, the slides and this material will be recorded. So if you've missed anything or you'd like to refer to the slides, they will all be available afterwards. So with that very broad opening, let me please hand over now to UNODC and UNCTAD, to Enrico and to Steve, to share with you this new statistical framework. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Gemma. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, we have, as two good brothers, me and Steve, who will do this presentation together. I will start and then I will hand over to him. Okay, it's a really a great pleasure for us, for me, also to be connected with you. Yeah, it reminded also me a bit of the short time I spent in Bangkok with ESCAP 1 year ago. Me and Steve, try to show you briefly where we are in the development of this statistical framework on illicit financial flows. And then, yes, Salome will tell you more a bit about the implementation of a few pilot studies in Latin America. Okay, I will share now the presentation with you. I hope you can see that?
Yes, that's great. Thanks very much.
Okay. 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 When we started the work on this SDG indicator in 2015, we really knew it was a very challenging topic. You know, illicit financial flows are there are very different perspectives, understandings on what they are, which are the policy areas affected. It has always been very important for us to keep a very close link to what the target of a goal 16 of the SDG of the 2030 agenda is about, which is is really the target. It's important to recall that is about significantly reduce illicit financial flows and then also arms flows, and combat all forms of organized crime, very briefly. And the indicator itself is about the total value of inward and outward illicit financial flows in US dollars. So there is, again, already from the indicator, we can understand we want to see both sides of illicit financial flows, those incoming and those outgoing. So it's not about a gross measure of everything that is, can be considered to be illicit, but again, about inflows and outflows. The first challenge we had to face is really to reach a common understanding on what illicit financial flows are for statistical purposes, for the purpose of measuring. And we can say now there is we reached a very broad and strong consensus on 3 elements. So that 3 constituencies of 3 aspects, we can say, of illicit financial flows. They are international transfers of illicitly earned capital, and so anything that is moved abroad from a country or into a country from capitals that have been earned illicitly, so illicit origin, or they are again capital transferred abroad for illicit purposes, or originally legal capital that are transferred illicitly, so in the way they are transferred. So they can be either illicitly earned, illicitly used, or illicitly transferred. So we can say that there are 3 core elements to this definition. So we are clearly talking about illicit flows, and then Steve will expand later on, also some difference between nuances between illicit and illegal. We are talking about cross-border transfers, not domestic. And finally, we are talking about flows, not stocks. Yeah, so flows that occurred during a given period. Of course, we always refer to a year traditionally, conventionally. So it's important to keep this in mind, these three things that can seem simple, but they are not, because if we look around, for example, on many attempts, many also academic literature on this, not always these elements are found in, for example, in estimates that can be produced by other actors. If this is sorry, I hope, yeah. If you want the framework, I mean, the definition of what illicit financial flows are, it's also very important to keep in mind that illicit financial flows can have can be related to very different policy areas. We know they are a bit at the crossroad of many different illicit activities. So we try to categorize all these possible illicit activities that can generate illicit financial flows. And it was, of course, a work of both, to identify categories that can be relevant from a policy perspective, so that they are clearly linked to different policy areas, but also there are categories that can be measured. They can have each of them different, features of statistical, feasibility. So they can be measured often in different ways. And we identified these four main categories of illicit financial flows. So the ones that refer more to illicit tax and commercial practices, and then which were the focus, the core agency is UNCTAD, and Steve will speak broadly later on this. And then there are three other categories, types of illicit financial flows. The ones related to corruption, many different forms of corruption. The ones related to, we call them exploitation types. So there are different types of illegal activities like trafficking persons or slavery, forced labor, or even theft or kidnapping, where there are certain, these activities where illicit assets are transferred illicitly from one person or one group to another. And then there are, the last typology refers to illegal markets, where there are real markets. So there are, economic transactions taking place, but of course of illicit nature, that take place in our countries. So whether they are, for example, related to drugs or firearms or smuggling of migrants. So we identified these four main types of illicit financial flows. And the idea, of course, is for each of them, we can develop separated estimates that would eventually be summed up. But it's important to keep in mind this disaggregated approach. Just want to make an example of what we are.
Excuse me, Enrico, you're still on slide 3. So you need to move your slides forward.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, then, yeah, it's. So this is slide 4. So it's what I just said. Sorry, but because I have I have a double screen that Okay. Then this is an example of illicit financial flows emerging from drug trafficking. Just if in any given country we can have drug being trafficked to the country, and of course when the drug is trafficked to the country, there is a corresponding flow of money going out of the country, of course, to pay for that drug. And so in this this transaction, there is already an illicit financial flow. When drug is trafficked to a country, then of course there are a number of activities that are conducted, whether the drug can be processed or just simply distributed from the wholesale to the retail sale. So in this process, value is generated, and this value, part of this income, is a tradition. We know that is eventually also transferred abroad, because the crime proceeds often are transferred abroad to be hidden from authorities. So again, there is another illicit financial flows here. So that you can see, in this very simple example, that there are already two types of illicit financial flows. One, and this applies generally to all types of illegal activities that we deal with. There is a set of illicit financial flows that is generated while the activity is developed. Illicit activities, similar to illicit activities, have their own value chain. And then in this chain, there are illicit financial flows that can be generated when there are transfers with cross-border transfers. And then there is another type of illicit financial flows that take place when the value, the income generated from these illegal activities, part of that income is transferred abroad. Think, for example, corruption. Then we know that typically a large share of money that is earned from corruption is transferred abroad. So it's important to be able to differentiate these two types of illicit financial flows, and of course, for each of them there are different challenges, in understanding how the market function. And then, of course, there are different challenges also in terms of the data and the information that can be used to estimate. So just for example, just in this slide, we are summarizing the type of challenges that we need to face when we want to measure illicit financial flows related respectively to income generation, when the illegal activity is developed. So there is a series of flows that take place between the country and each country and the other countries. So we need to know, for example, in the case of drugs, how much drug is trafficked to the country, what are the prices, how much drug is consumed in the country, and so on. And then there are other types of challenges, and then of course data sources that are needed to know how much of all the proceeds of that illicit, of any specific illicit activities, are transferred abroad. So, and then here there are different types, of course, of information we need to gain on how the various illicit actors use the money, and then of course which data sources can be used. I will stop here and hand over to Steve, who will continue on specifically on the part related to tax and commercial purposes. Of course, if there is any question, we will be very happy to answer later. Steve, the floor is yours. I will continue. Yeah.
Hello, everybody, and welcome from our greetings from Geneva. So I'm going to talk now about the other part of the project, which is dealing with really illicit commercial activities. So Enrico has set out the background very well about what illicit financial flows are and what they're not. A slight complexity on the economic side is trying to really parse this word illicit and what's the difference between illicit and illegal. And really that centers around legal activities that are damaging. So on the commercial side, we're looking at illicit tax and commercial practices, which is a combination of illegal tax and commercial practices, so practices that are breaking the law, but also practices that aren't necessarily breaking the law, but they are damaging in the sense that they're destructive to an economy. And this concept is trickier, particularly because the really tricky element is to decide what's the difference between a strategically sensible tax avoidance strategy and what makes it aggressive or destructive, and at what point, where's the tipping point? And so this has been quite a tricky piece of work, and it's also been, I think it's fair to say, quite contentious. Not everybody agrees, but when you think back to what the General Assembly agreed when they set this target, they deliberately used the word illicit, and they chose that word for a reason, and that reason really centers around this issue. So if I go on to the next slide. So really what we're talking about then on the commercial side is illegal activities, which is stuff that's breaking the law. So it's tax evasion, it's competition offences, market manipulation. So this is things like mispricing, which is often the traditional measure of illicit financial flows, which is part of the package. But the problem is the traditional measures to date haven't been comprehensive enough. So what we'll also be looking at is what's called profit shifting or aggressive profit shifting, strategic location or movement of debt and intellectual property. So a lot of this will center around large multinational activity and how they move their profits and their money from one jurisdiction to another. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is where it gets tricky. So this is trying to show you now a continuum or a spectrum when we try and tease out this illegal versus illicit. So while tax avoidance is legal, and you can argue it's sensible for every company, every person to avoid paying unnecessary tax, what we call aggressive tax avoidance can be detrimental to sustainable development, and hence it's included. So now the trick is to figure out, well, what does that mean? So we can't base this element, we can't use legality or national laws as the defining characteristic, because what they're doing isn't per se illegal. So we have to define a boundary between legal and illicit and illegal in a way that we can measure it. So you can see starting on the left, you have tax planning, which is using tax provisions in the spirit of the law, and that makes sense. And then on the very right-hand side, you have illegal measures, that's clear as well, the tax evasion. The piece in the middle is where it gets a little bit fuzzy. And this is where you start rearranging your taxes to the point where it becomes destructive. And to a large extent, this is a slightly subjective measure. We have to come up with measures that somehow we can measure what's almost a moral distinction, but in an objective way, so that we can measure it consistently across different jurisdictions. Next slide. So that's the challenge on the commercial side. So then just coming back more broadly, so one of the reasons that IFFs have failed in the past, we believe, is that they haven't been sufficiently comprehensive. So what we're trying to do now is come up with country measures, so that allow each country to measure the IFFs from their perspective, but that allow us also to have a comprehensive measure that look at all the types of issues that Enrico mentioned, but then also in addition now add in these tax and destructive commercial practices. And the two have to be compatible in a way that we can add them together and that they're compatible with other standards. So in other words, that they don't jar with the balance of payments or national accounting concepts and standards. And that's been the kind of the real challenge. So to do this, UNCTAD ODC have a task force traditionally, which is made up of countries and agencies. So for example, the IMF, Eurostat, OECD are members, but also countries from Latin America, from Europe. I don't think we have one or two from Asia as well. And we're really looking for help from countries who have experience in this field to see what practices have they adopted, how have they measured it, and then from there we're gonna tease out a kind of a recipe book of practices that countries can adopt. Enrico and Salome have a project in Latin America which is already long-standing, where they've been working with INEGI, which Salome will talk about shortly. And then on the UNCTAD side, with the Regional Commission for Africa, we've started a similar project looking at kind of commercial tax practices. And the reason we've focused on Africa to date is that this is a very large issue in Africa, particularly for resource-rich countries. So one of the areas where we see a lot of issues around illicit financial flows is commodity-rich countries, where we see a lot of mispricing, and that's where some of the biggest leakages are happening. So the next step now is to involve the national statistical offices in Asia Pacific as well. And one of the advantages of coming to you now is that a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the conceptual work has been done. So when we've been working with Latin America and with Africa, we've been teasing out these issues as we've been going along. But now as we come to you, a lot of the conceptual work has been done, and now we're really getting into the more methodological work. So it's good news for Asia Pacific. You'll be able to hit the ground running much faster. Next slide. So future steps. So UNCTAD and UNODC, we're just about to publish the conceptual framework. We spared you the detail today, but for those of you who are really interested in the meat of this, we'll be publishing a detailed conceptual framework. And then the next steps are to start publishing then methodological guidelines that complement the conceptual framework. So for UNODC, and I guess Salome will talk a bit more about this, they're further advanced on the criminal side. They've been working on this much longer than we have on the illicit side. So they'll be able to share some pilot studies in Latin America. On the tax and commercial side, we're now only really beginning to develop the methodological kind of cookbook that allows us to implement the conceptual framework. But as soon as we have the results available from those pilot studies, we will publish them as well to complement the work that UNODC has done. And I don't know if there's another slide.
No.
No, okay.
That's great. Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks very much, Enrico. I think that was a really good introduction to the concepts as well as the methodological challenges. We'll just now move quickly into Salome to share with you the experience here of Latin America and Caribbean. We're up to about 1:30, Salome. So thanks. Over to you.
Thank you, Gemma, and thanks everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It depends on which time zone you are. It's very good to be with you and be able to share with you the initial results of this pilot to measure illicit financial flows in Latin America. I think I'm gonna jump to the results because my colleagues already described very comprehensively the methodological framework and the rationality behind the framework. And just to say, well, the objective of this pilot was to adapt and test the methodology to measure IFFs. We had 4 participating countries, and initially we had 5, but we ended up with 4 only. So the countries participating were Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. The first time we got together with all of them was back in 2018. And back then we were trying to discuss and really identify if we were going to be able to do this pilot. And of course, one of the main constraints was availability of data. And we had a discussion also about which illicit markets were relevant for the Latin American region. And we ended up with an agreement between all the participating countries to try to measure drug trafficking, trafficking in person, smuggling of migrants, and illegal mining. And we have made some progress, and I have to say, I mean, we're very happy with the results, but of course, we haven't been able to measure the 4 illicit markets in the 4 countries because every market behaves differently in every one of the countries. But we have promising results, which I will share with you in a minute. So this is the framework. And again, I'm going back to Enrico's presentation because this is UNODC. So this is about illicit markets and only those 4 markets that I already mentioned to you. The focus of this pilot has to do mainly with income generation. And the first step for us was to understand the complexity of illicit supply chains and all the production processes in order to break down all the transaction and really be able to identify where did the transactions occur. Because this is the starting point for the methodology, to understand where the transaction occurred and really to identify if it was a flow between countries. So this was one of the first complexities, to understand the location of the transactions and to understand if it was performed across a border. So this is, this is just like the summary, and the examples I have today are from Mexico. One of them has to do with the smuggling of migrants, and the second one has to do with drug trafficking. So for smuggling of migrants, well, you see here in the screen, this is the Mexico's map. And you know that we have a huge migration from countries in Central America, mainly Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So these are the countries that really have a huge number of people, and you can see the number, the amount there in the screen. So basically they cross the Mexico southern border, and they have to travel all the way to the US because US is basically their destination country. So smuggling of migrants is conceptually the procurement of the illegal entry of a person into a state party of which the person is not a national or a permanent resident. So smuggling of migrants is always transnational in that it involves irregular movement between at least 2 countries or even more, 3, for example, in our case. It usually takes place in dangerous or degrading conditions. It affects the states and their borders. It does, in this trafficking, persons are not perceived as victims because actually they consent this smuggling. And of course, it's a source of huge profits. And the smugglers mainly profit from transportation or facilitating this transportation from one country to another. So the overall income is generated or can be calculated by the fees that I paid to the smugglers by all these migrants in a given time, let's say a year. So the profits from the criminals come from their ability to facilitate this illegal entry into a country or crossing another country, and finally helping irregular migrants to reach its final destination, because typically their destination wouldn't be in the border, but rather, in this case, further north. The data that we collected was related to the services provided by the smugglers. This is how much were they paid. And you see in this map, we have like different flows. So we have the main flow here in the southern border, but then across Mexico, there are different borders. And actually, this was very interesting from the pilot, because we were able to map different routes depending on the nationality of the migrants. Some of them would go to the east, some of them would go to the west. There are different routes, and this is perhaps one of the findings of this pilot, that we were able to work out with the Mexican authorities different routes, different prices, different modus operandi. So it was very informative, not only for us and for the purposes of the pilot, but also for the authorities, because in a way they were able to see the market from a different perspective, and to try to break it down from, let's say, an economic perspective, but it was, again, very informative from the policy perspective as well. So to summarize, the regular migrants are provided a set of services such as transportation or lodging, and they also receive some guidance for them to reach their final destination. And well, this involves lots of transactions, including extortions, including to authorities, of course, including well, different risky situations during the transit and at the border as well. And so after this analysis, we were able to produce a figure. So in this slide here, you can see the estimated inward and outward illicit financial flows from smuggling of migrants in Mexico. And as you can see, the huge market here, it's really the inward illicit financial flows. So many smugglers in Mexico benefit from this market and from the different migrants that are coming from different countries in Central America. And the way we estimated this was adding up two main financial flows. The ones that are related to crossing from origin to transit country, and again, the second one, crossing from the border to the destination countries. So that's basically how we estimated this inward illicit financial flow that has to do with smuggling of migrants. And yeah, well, I already described that in order to produce these results, we really had to work together with the Mexican authorities. I have to say that we only managed to produce results on the smuggling of migrants in Latin America and Mexico because we have a huge survey that basically collects data from the migrants in the southern border of Mexico, but also in the northern border before they cross. So this was our main source of information, of prices, of modus operandi, and on routes and different things that really help us to identify specific patterns, and then really help us to produce the estimates. So this is the example of smuggling of migrants, and now I'm going to proceed with the second example that has to do with drug trafficking. And I have two slides here. This one has to do with the estimated gross inward illicit financial flows per drug in Mexico. And here we have the average between 2015 and 2018 per substance. So as you can see in this slide, the most profitable substance is cannabis. And that's the most lucrative, followed by heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. And the sum of these four values resulted in an average of almost $20 billion of inward illicit financial flows. And well, it's an interesting perspective to look at it from the substance perspective, because I mean, you can really see from year to year how the different substances are behaving differently. And actually, we now know that there are other substances, but of course, again, data, it's not easy to find. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that if we included other years, you can see really fluctuations in the substances and how one of them become less lucrative and others increase in their value. So again, in the drug trafficking, I have to say that we really have to adapt the methodology, because in Latin America, some countries are more like production countries, other ones are more like transit countries, and other ones are destination countries. For which slide are you in? Because I just read a message saying something about I think that was my slides were stuck maybe in a previous one. I don't know which slide are you looking at now?
The slide looks at the pilot to measure the IFF. I still have that on screen.
Yeah. Can we suggest that you refresh your screen? For some of us, we're up to the slide that has the by year. Salome, go back to your slide, Salome, up to the one you were on, which is slide 8, which was the drugs by year. But if people are still seeing slide 2, you can refresh your screen. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I'm reloading and.
Okay, it's moving now. Yeah.
It's moving now.
Yeah,
Okay, this was the one about income generation, and this is the Mexico's map.
Yep. Now keep moving. Further.
Okay, this is the inward in smuggling of migrants. This is the drug trafficking per substance, and well, I'm moving to the almost last one. Okay. Which is about the inwards illicit financial flows from drug trafficking from 2015 to 2018. And as you can see there, well, the way we measure this was by building relevant data according to the model used for produced drugs or non-produced drugs. This is consumption, production, seizures, market share, and of course the prices. And yeah, I think this was almost the last one. I only included some challenges, but I think it's a bit similar of what Enrico already mentioned. We have some challenges, mainly methodologically, because we have to adapt the existing methodology to really fit how the market behaves in each one of the countries. Another challenge was to foster cooperation between different actors. We had to do a lot of raising awareness about the importance of the indicators and the results. And well, a huge challenge, of course, was data collection because crime statistics are very sensitive, and especially in this area, it wasn't easy to access data. We also found that many countries have data, but because of the sensitivity, it wasn't easy for them to share, but we managed to have arrangement with them so they could really share the information and we could work out a way of anonymizing the information. But of course, also data is scarce, and that was those were some of the challenges. Now about the benefits, we wanted to include some benefits there. We have to say that it was very informative for countries, because sometimes, I mean, we had to be very creative about identifying good data sources, and sometimes even for the authorities, was a surprise to see that perhaps they had data that we could use and somehow yeah, to incorporate the information that they had in the models. But yeah, it was a bit creative, but it was good for them because again, they saw their own data from a different perspective. And like I mentioned already, they started to think about their markets from a different perspective. And another benefit that we saw was that by conducting the pilot, we brought together different countries and different authorities. And in a way, they are now are engaging in a dialogue and sharing information on their own and sharing practices. So this is kind of building a community around these illicit financial flows that I think is very beneficial for the region. And this is a starting point, and I'm sure that the future of this work will be very relevant, not only for countries nationally, but also regionally. So, well, thank you. And yeah, too bad that my presentation got stuck, but the slides are there with you. And of course, happy to answer questions. Thank you, Gemma.
Yeah, thank you very much, Salome.
Thank you.
That was excellent, and really great to see the practical examples of the conceptual framework that Steve and Enrico put forward and made it really concrete to give us some statistics by, in that case, illegal, illicit migrants and drugs, and in the case of Mexico. We do have a few technical questions coming in, but I think what I might do first is just quickly run through the project that we're launching here today, and then we'll turn to our experts to share with you, so that, respond to you on some of those questions there. So I'm just going to now share with you, Salome. You may need to stop sharing your screen, but you can see the project screen towards the measurement framework? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So as I said, as this cafe said at the start, what we're trying to do is work towards a measurement framework for illicit financial flows, but really it needs to be very country driven, as Steve just highlighted and Salome highlighted. So what we're key messages today is, if you are interested in estimating the size of illicit financial flows, we have this project that's kicking off, and you'll be directly supported by experts from UNODC, UNCTAD, and ourselves here in ESCAP. So these pilot studies for selected illegal markets, so it may be drugs, or it might be migrants, or it could be any other topic as seen in the conceptual framework there, will be conducted in pilot countries over the next 2 years, 2021 and 2022. That's calendar year. And what we'll do is we'll support you with technical guidance. As Steve from UNCTAD said, this technical guidance and the conceptual framework's well developed now, so we're off to a good start. We'll provide you with training and with assistance. We do want, though, the results of these pilot studies to be jointly disseminated. And as you heard from Salome, some of these statistics are quite sensitive, but we would like the results to be jointly disseminated. And we'd like you to we're inviting you to submit an expression of interest by the end of October, and we've prepared a template for you. The broad time frame, as I've just said, is to launch it, call for this expression of interest. We will make some decisions by the end of 2020 on which pilot countries and which pilot studies will go forward. These pilot studies will then be undertaken in 2021 and 2022, working directly with consultants, working directly with you to provide that guidance, assistance and training. And we want to close the project and jointly disseminate the results towards the end of 2022. This is a great opportunity for the National Statistical Office. We are putting forward a package that includes participation in regional meetings and workshops to ensure this coordination. And as you heard from Salome, in Latin America and the Caribbean, one of the great benefits here was undertaking a mapping of all the different institutions, uncovering what data actually may exist, and then strengthening that partnership with institutions. So I think we've got some real benefits that we've just heard from Salome. The NSO would then host a national workshop where we would explain this methodology, provide some advocacy around the purpose or the importance, identify activities and identify the institutional partners to work with. You'd then participate in national training to particularly assess data availability, but then also to obtain this data, collect the data, undertake some estimations with full support from our partners and the consultant and the production of the statistics. We'd also ask that you participate in the implementation of the methodology. And so this is a really great opportunity to make sure that the methodology is relevant to our region here in Asia and the Pacific. We'd then host a follow-up national workshop where the results of the testing can be illustrated, exactly like we've just heard from Salome, and to provide some input into future improvements. And finally, to participate in a regional seminar to present the overall results, promote understanding of illicit financial flows in Asia Pacific, and to discuss some future actions. So we're looking at about 6 different roles for the National Statistics Office here. This involvement is spread over the 2 years. We're hoping first quarter next year, 2021, to hold these expert group meeting and engage the consultants, and then give a 12-month period to do the pilot studies. So from Q2 next year through to the first quarter in 2022. We'd then have the majority of 22 to hold the national workshops, finalise the reporting, and hold the final seminar in the last quarter. So if you're interested in this, and if this topic is particular relevance to you, and even I think actually it's not only is the topic particularly relevant to you, but it's also an opportunity again to build this institutional network within your country, the leadership role for the National Stats Office, but also to contribute to the methodological developments. We're asking you to submit an expression of interest by the end of October, and we'll select those countries taking into account these 4 things: your interest, your willingness to collect and share some data. Now, this is willingness of your country, not just the National Stats Office, the relevance of illicit financial flows in your country, and the quality and structure of the proposed activities for the pilot. And we've prepared a template for an expression of interest where we're just going to ask you, actually it's only 8 questions long, asking for a very brief description of your situation, which pilot studies would be of most interest in your country, the availability of studies or data that could assist in furthering that pilot study, and then any stakeholder implementation challenges that you may have that we'd need to work through with you as part of that process. And in putting together an expression of interest, the UNODC Data and Development Dissemination Section, Enrico and his team are very happy to help. So that was a very brief run through of basically this expression of interest process that we will share with you. So I'm now going to turn to questions and answers, and we have actually a couple of questions and answers, not answers yet. Hopefully Steve, Enrico, or Salome can answer these. But I think from the couple of questions that have come in, they're very much on the methodological front. So while I ask a couple of these first questions, please, if you have any questions, either raise your hand in MS Teams, put a question in the chat box, and then we'll come to you. So the first question, and Steve, this is probably comes back to this question of, the comment that you made very early on in your presentation, is that one country's illicit financial flow may be perfectly legal in another country. So where you have something legal in one country but not in the other country. So how does the National Stats Office measure this? And it brings in the issue of non-observed economy.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. So, 2 really good questions. So let me start with the first one. As the question raises, illegality may differ from country to country, but this is why when we've developed the conceptual framework and we've looked at illicit activities, we've identified the activities from a conceptual point of view that are to be considered illicit. So in a way, it doesn't really matter now whether the activity is legal or illegal, because we've mapped out the activities that are considered illicit within the conceptual framework. So in other words, we've already set the menu of activities to be included. Now, obviously, country to country, all of those activities may be more or less relevant, so that they may not have to cover all of those activities. In terms of the shadow economy, this is exactly the point. The activities that we're dealing with are deliberately hidden, and this is why it's so challenging to measure them. I mean, they're not ones that are out in the open, whether they're illegal or not. I mean, even tax avoidance, these are not well advertised practices. They're very subtle in how they're done. So again, this is where the methodology will then help countries. We'll kind of map out the steps to identify these practices. And I think that's why, I mean, what you've seen, what Salome did in Mexico, I mean, obviously, like, drugs are deliberately hidden. So this is the whole point of this exercise, is to help countries identify things that are not well advertised, and in fact are deliberately hidden. And just to say as a final comment to countries, I mean, in a way, this is a perfect illustration. This project is a perfect illustration of why countries need a national statistical system. So, for example, ESCAP published a statistics brief last year, I think it was number 19, about integrated statistics. So this is a perfect illustration of why you're going to need integrated statistics, because as Salome mentioned, the NSO can't do this on their own. They're going to have to talk to central banks, to customs, to police, to ministries, financial authorities. Depending on the activity, they're going to have to integrate a lot of data from different sources. So this is why this is a perfect illustration of the broader issue as well of developing a national statistics system. So you can share information, you have the legal framework to do that. And that's the only way you can address such a complex issue and such an issue that's kind of neatly tucked away and hidden from view. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Steve. Actually, there's a follow-up one from BPS Indonesia, and the question is how to strengthen inclusive financial in small and medium-sized enterprises. But I'm just wondering there if anyone from BPS Indonesia is online, I'm wondering if this is the question's more how can you measure the illicit financial flows or for small and medium-sized enterprises? Because you said at the start that the framework's mainly around big enterprises, but if you can comment, I hope I haven't paraphrased the question wrong, but it said how to strengthen inclusive financial in small and medium-sized, so it's small and medium-sized.
Yeah, thanks. Another very good question. So the approaches that we're developing, we'll be using data sources from central banks, financial authorities, and so forth. So depending on their system, small and medium-sized enterprises may or may not be included in their data. Small ones probably less likely, but from a leakage point of view, that's probably okay, because even if they're involved in aggressive tax avoidance, it's probably going to have very small impact. Whereas on the kind of authority side, if they're involved in tax evasion, then for sure they'll be within the net of interest.
Thanks, Steve. And the final one I've got so far, and again, remind you if you do have any questions, please do put your hand up. Is base erosion and profit shifting by multinational corporations included in scope?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, this is why we're working with OECD. So the base erosion and profit shifting, I mean, this is the core of what we're talking about. So when I'm talking about aggressive tax avoidance, that's another way of describing effectively base erosion and profit shifting. They're different terms, but effectively we're talking about the same thing.
Okay, that's great. Final question comes from our Secretariat for the Pacific Communities, the Chief Statistician over there, Eppley, who's asked, how can national stats officers improve the measurement of such flows? And I think today's Stats Cafe actually shows you an example of how we can actually help at national stats of improve the measurement of stats flows. From my point of view, getting involved in this pilot approach to development of the measurement framework and to testing it and working with our experts from UNODC and UNCTAD to help undertake a pilot study is one way National Stats Office can improve the measurement of such flows. But let me turn over here to Enrico, Salome, Steve as well, whether you'd like to make any observations on that comment from our Pacific Secretariat of the Pacific Community. Thanks. Enrico, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Gemma. No, yeah, it's. I think Thanks, for the question, which is crucial. I believe to make it happen, because I mean the statistical offices have a number of assets in their pockets, I would say, to develop good measures of illicit financial flows. They have, of course, the methodological, we believe, expertise. And this was said also, I mean, as Steve was mentioning before, we try to develop this framework in a way that is consistent with existing frameworks, with the ones on national accounts, balance of payments. This is why, for example, this concept that many people, I believe, are familiar with in this call about what are economic transactions, when there is, for example, the mutual acceptance, there is an transaction, then there is a real economic transaction. When there is no mutual consent, there is not really an economic transaction. This distinction was at the basis, for example, between when we distinguish between illegal markets and exploitation type activities. So you see that we try to build a framework that is fully consistent with what is already there, so that we don't come up with of course, doesn't mean that it's a completely replicating, but it's consistent. So we are not trying to to build estimates that can really be inconsistent with what a country is producing and the statistical office produce in terms of GDP estimates, of balance of payment estimates. So this is a methodological expertise. Then there is the capacity, we believe, of national statistical offices, again, to bring around the table many different stakeholders. And it's difficult, especially in these very sensitive topics, where there can be very different, the political sensitivities about talking any of these issues, whether it's tax evasion or corruption or drug trafficking. I mean, it's difficult to bring again around the table different stakeholders if it's not by another agency that is not the statistical office, where the statistical office, as the statistical office has this in any country, the statistical entity is perceived as a neutral and honest broker that where there is no political interest in anything, but just the good the interest to produce good data, good evidence. And this is a role that the statistical office really can play at its most in this area, in this activity. And finally, I also wanted to mention the fact that for many of these topics, we need also a transnational view. Whether when you talk, for example, on trafficking or even on corruption, we need to put together data from different countries. It's difficult to do this in isolation. It is possible. It's much better to do that when you can communicate, share data among countries. And this, again, the statistical agencies are often connected internationally.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Enrico. I think you're frozen there, so I might, thanks, Enrico. Salome, anything you want to, you've shared with us a lot of benefits and challenges there in your last slide, which was excellent, by the way. But, what would how can the NSOs improve the measurement of illicit financial flows in your view?
Yeah, actually, we have had this discussion before, because I have to be honest, in our region, it was a bit difficult to involve the NSOs because they are not the ones, let's say, producing this information. Like Steve and Enrico already mentioned, they can do a lot because they have the expertise, they have the standards, they have the connections. Let's say that they can do the steering, but they're not the ones that own the data or collect this data or generate this data necessarily. I think the key role that they have here is to really lead the effort, because NSOs are the ones that knows the standards and have even the mandate, because I mean they are in charge of the national statistical systems. But yeah, I think we had to work with them a lot to really kind of helping them to see the benefits of having this exercise. And yeah, I mean, naturally they were curious, and they're still curious about the results. So yeah, I guess it's good to have them leading this effort, because they really can do a lot. And Gemma, there is another question about transactions with cryptocurrencies. Just want to say that in our pilot we didn't include that, but I know that UNODC has some softwares to actually kind of monitor cryptocurrencies. So it would maybe in the future we can perhaps find some connections, because not in the in the pilot we didn't analyze cryptocurrencies, but I know there is expertise in UNODC to monitor transactions with cryptocurrencies. And just to say something else, I think illicit markets behave very differently from the region to region. So a good way to start in Asia Pacific would be to have a discussion on which markets are relevant for the region and which markets would make sense to start this pilot. Because I mean, in our region, we had even other markets, but countries agreed to measure these 4 markets. So I'm sure that in Africa, it's a different story. And again, in Asia, I'm sure there are other markets. So perhaps the first starting point would be to discuss which are the illicit markets that are relevant for that region.
Yeah, thanks, Salome. Actually, while we've got you, can you also address this question from our chief statistician from Samoa, who's asked, were you able to get data from people involved in the trafficking of migrants?
Not from the smugglers. I mean, we didn't interview any smugglers. Like I said, we were very lucky because we found this survey that actually it's a very serious survey, and it has been conducted for a number of years. But they interview the migrants, not the smugglers, but the migrants. And of course, they're a very rich source of information, because they would say lots of things about their experience and how they lived this transit from their countries of origins to reach into their destination countries, which in most of the cases were the US.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Salome. Does Steve or Enrico, anything to add on this question of methods for measuring transactions via cryptocurrencies? Steve?
Not on cryptocurrencies.
Enrico? Oh, you're on mute, Enrico.
Yeah, just to say that so far we didn't, I mean, there are illicit financial flows can take place through many different channels, whether it's cash or bank transfers or any other type of transfers. So far, the focus has been on the amounts transferred, so estimating the amounts, not yet on the channels used to do these transactions. But this is part of the further methodological work that is needed.
And similarly, following up on this, not so much cryptocurrency, but the previous question around data, Rosie's just asked, since the data is taking about the illegit or illicit activities, it's quite difficult to get a response. So collecting the data itself is one of the big challenges that certainly was on Salome's slides, and I know both of you mentioned it, but this is why we're giving like 12 months or so for the pilot, working with national consultants to help scavenging the data and work with the institutions. Any comment on that, Enrico, while we've got you?
Yeah, of course, we don't, this is an area where we can go simply to, a market and make a simple, traditional data collection, you know, in a supermarket or in a bank or whatever. So it's always there is always a lot of we can collect data on some elements, whether, for example, the traffic, the seizures of drugs, or we know from the police the price we can know of the of the drug, the retail. Or the wholesale level. So it's always we have to put together different elements, many small elements that together can put we can build the entire picture. So this is the work that is needed always in this kind of activities. But yeah, so we have to put, this is what, the example that Salome made, I think, on smuggling migrants was very illustrative. You have to put together information, very different types of information, then to build the entire picture.
And while we're on the topic of data, do you think it would, again, we have a question from Samoa, do you think it would help if we got data from the prisoners, like those involved in drug trafficking?
I mean, this is something, yeah, this is, of course, something that we also, I mean, for example, do to know how the trafficking works in any given country, because you have to, it's either usually the law enforcement, that they have this qualitative information where the drug comes from, or any other illicit good or service. How the market functions. So it can be often come from either the law enforcement, criminal justice system, or another set of people who know are criminals. Yes, this is something that, of course, it's not to know exactly the amounts or the quantities, but to know how a given market functions. This can be very important.
A question from me. We have two very large oceans in Asia and the Pacific, and obviously drugs. We've talked about the two examples from Mexico, drugs and migrants. But what about? I'm just wondering about illicit trade of markets that might be ocean-based. I'm thinking here fishing or cargo. I'm not sure. Is that within scope? I'm looking at both Enrico and Steve. Would that be a market that would be of interest to this measurement framework? Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. We haven't thought about fishing per se, but certainly the movement of commodities is definitely within scope. And this is where I talked about this term misinvoicing. So this is where a commodity leaves a country and it's priced differently to where it's imported on the other side, so there's a mismatch. So any kind of, and that's basically a kind of a tax evasion by another name. So people are avoiding paying tariffs or other duties, and a lot of that stuff will move by ship. So it could be gold, it could be any kind of a mineral. So in theory, it could be fish as well. I mean, it's not one we've traditionally thought about, but conceptually, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. So a lot of that stuff will move by ship.
Yeah, I agree that I think it's something in a way similar, for example, to what we had in Latin America with illegal mining. So where you have an illegal exploitation of a natural resource. Whenever there is something like this happening, it can certainly be included in this framework. Of course, especially when it is significant in quantitative terms. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Well, look, we've got about, we're sort of coming to the end of the questions here, but the questions that I haven't asked you were basically how can NSOs get involved, and how can the UN resident coordinator officers and UN country teams get involved? Let me try and answer this first. Today, what we're doing today is launching this project on supporting countries and to get involved in the measurement of illicit financial flows. We've got the support you here from UNODC, UNCTAD and ESCAP. And we're inviting not just NSOs, but we're inviting countries to get involved. But we'd really like this to be an opportunity for the NSO to lead and to work with partners in their statistical system to bring together the sort of statistical experts with the subject matter experts and the customs and the criminal justice system and all the different actors in the statistical system to undertake a national pilot to measure some market that's of relevance to you, the country, with the support of our experts. And we're going to support you with a national level consultant to help you work through that over a 12, 18-month period. So how can you get involved? First of all, it's great you're here today. We attached to the invite to today's seminar a expression of interest form. We will be resending that out to our mailing lists, which include not only the National Statistics Office, but also the resident coordinator offices. We encourage you to give it some thought. The time frame is a consideration, so you need to be available over the next 2 years. The subject matter is also important. You know, if this is an important issue, important policy issue for your government, then here's an opportunity for you to get involved. If it's an important area of statistics that your statistics office wants to get involved in, if you want to use this as an opportunity to improve your crime and justice statistics, here's an opportunity for you. And if the country teams are there listening in, if this is a priority that's in the UN Development Cooperation Framework, then here's an opportunity for you to also reach out to the NSO. So I suppose my message to you is, how can the NSOs and country teams get involved? Well, being here today is a great first start. Read the documentation we've shared with you and we'll share with you again. If you have specific questions, Enrico, who's with us today, is very happy to answer questions, as are all of us. We've got the template for an expression of interest due until the end of October. So you've got 5 or 6 weeks to think about it. Reach out to your NSS counterparts, talk to your governments to see if this is something that's relevant to you and that you'd like to get involved in over the next 12, 24 months. So I'll stop there, but basically maybe ask Enrico and Steve if you want to pick that comment up and then give you a sort of, it's part of your closing comments. Thanks. Steve, back to you.
Thanks, Gemma. Well, I think you said it well, that this is an opportunity for countries to get involved. We very much see the National Statistical Office, as Salome put it, in the driving seat. But again, we emphasize this will be a national statistical system effort. Like a statistics office cannot do this on their own. And this is maybe where I saw a question about the resident coordinator. This is where the resident coordinators can perhaps help. If countries haven't developed the network, then the convening power of the UN may be helpful in, because it's going to be essential to bring in all these partners. Because the other point that Enrico made, which is very important, this isn't going to be a simple exercise where you go to a market and you roll out a bespoke questionnaire. This is more like a national accounting exercise where you're taking fragments of information and you're gluing them together like a jigsaw. So it's a much more analytical exercise that you try and build within a framework rather than just rolling out another survey. So I think that's really all I want to emphasize. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Enrico.
Oh, thanks. There is very little to add at this point. I just think really would like to reiterate the invitation to statistical systems, people, representatives, people in this call and other people that can be reached later, to participate, to join this project by making an application, through this expression of interest. I think this is can be as the examples made, for example, by Salome, really to produce figures, numbers on this very important topic. I don't think it's only in our organization, but it's many, international fora that this issue of illicit financial flows is brought is attracting a lot of attention, and this is our opportunity as a statistical community to bring our contribution, to bring the evidence about this topic, and we see that it's possible. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy undertaking, but it's possible. And I think it would be great to have this exercises conducted successfully in the Asia Pacific region. Again, don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us to ask any question. As already was said by Salome and others, the cases that were selected in Latin America were selected because, of course, they are very relevant there. There can be others. Gemma, you made the example of illegal fishing, which I think would be very much relevant. There are others, I don't know, illegal gambling that can be relevant in the region. So don't hesitate first to ask any clarification that you might need to fill in the expression of interest. That any of us would be very happy to assist you. Thanks again for the participation, the interest.
Thanks very much, Enrico. And Salome, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Yeah, no, well, just to say thank you very much for this chance. And well, it doesn't look easy because it's new. And I mean, just to say that we did struggle a lot in finding the information, but like I said, we're very happy because we're producing results, and then we're even more happy because results are relevant for the authorities. In a way, it's stimulating for them to see the markets from a different perspective, and this is what we want to do, right? We want to, I don't know, produce actions with data. So I mean, just to keep that in mind, that this is useful at the end of the day. It's not easy, but it's not impossible.
That's wonderful. That's just fantastic. And Salome has been a real champion for this area of statistics for a long time. So it's really great to have you here with us, sharing your experience. Thanks very much. Well, we've come to the close of our session today, our cafe today. Thank you so much for all of your questions, for staying with us for the last hour and a half. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to Steve, Enrico, Salome, and the questions that have come through have been really excellent. So we will share with each of you that have registered today the recording, a link to the website and a link to the expression of interest, but we'll also again be sharing this with the Asia Pacific, the wider statistical community. But please go away, have a think about it, if it's relevant to you, if it's important to you, and particularly important to your country, as Salome says. It really is about having relevant statistics for your policy settings. And thank you to my speakers, Enrico, Steve from UNCTAD, and Salome. And thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been wonderful to be with you. Goodbye. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Goodbye, everybody.